And hello once again, my name is artsy Lupus, and today I'm going to be talking about the Sokal Hoax. But before we get into that, let me just say, if you appreciate these videos that I make and you would like to support them, because I've made way too many of them, you can check out my books or support me on Patreon, whatever you want to do. But we are going to move on from there and actually talk about the Sokal Hoax. So before we actually talk about the Sokal Hoax itself, why is this video called like Meta Theory through the Sokal Hoax? So essentially meta theory meaning something we're talking about theory itself. So this is something that sort of critiqued the theoretical understanding itself. So basically this is a way to actually look at academia itself through this Sokal Hoax, also sometimes known as the Sokal Affair. But when I was introduced to it, they called it the Sokal Hoax. So even though it's more commonly known as the Sokal Affair, I'm using hoax. So, Now, what is the Sokal Hoax? The Sokal Hoax was basically a fake paper that a man named Alan Sokal submitted to a journal called Social Text in 1996. Now, this paper was called Transgressing the Boundaries Towards a Transformative Hermeneutics of Quantum Gravity, which essentially posited that quantum gravity is a social construct rather than something physical. And it's basically filled with like a lot of nonsense gibberish. I did actually read the entire thing when I studied this because I wanted to just see, and it's all just jibber jabber. It's using obfuscation language sort of to sound clever while bringing like a whole bunch of scientific terms, and also the notes. The number of notes is just ludicrous. There's so many notes. It is a nonsense paper. And then like a few weeks or months, I can't remember exactly. Later, he published another paper in a journal called Lingua Franca, in which he said that it was nonsense. Transgressing the Boundaries was a fake paper. He made it up, and the reason that he did that, the reason that he submitted a fake paper filled with nonsense gibberish, was because he was critiquing Social Text, the journal that did it, and journals like it, that don't do peer reviews, that don't that are more happy about basically someone having academic authority rather than actually being correct, and how people in the humanities, or specifically more postmodern humanities, co-opt things they don't really understand in things like science to then use it for their own ends. So he was basically criticizing that. He was saying, listen, a whole bunch of these kind of philosophers love to, they love to bring up scientific concepts that they don't actually understand and then use it to try to say something about society. And he was criticizing that, and quite rightly, I would say, because that does tend to be a thing that happens. Like, there are certain areas in academia that are not very rigorous, and that is a problem. And it's a very interesting issue that he brought up. So let's talk about some of these problems, and we're going to be talking about it. So one of the main things is that he was what he was basically doing was that he was writing in such a way that he was trying to make the editors of the Social Text journal, he was essentially trying to inflate their egos. He was conforming to academic biases just to get published. That was his whole aim. It wasn't that article he wrote was real. It was that he was trying to show that you can publish nonsense if you just write in such a way that appeases the people who get to choose what goes into a journal. That is what they were doing. They were sort of being like, he wrote this to show that. So he was showing that academic biases happen, that people become, they stop actually caring about truth and understanding, and they start caring more about what like suits their worldview, right? So they're just conforming to what they want to be true, and so they make it be true, basically by being dishonest. And that is like a problem. Then, of course, the lack of peer review. That is a big, big thing, because something that Alan Sokal, was very, basically criticizing here, was angry about this, was that Social Text, right? Yes, it is a humanities-based journal. That is fine, right? I'm a humanities, student. Well, yeah, a postgraduate student. But, I am someone who cares about this kind of stuff. However, if you are going to have people submitting papers that are in some way related to a field that is not yours, you need to actually get reviewers who know the topic. If you are extremely good at literature, and you have people submit things that are related to science, you need to have people who know science to be able to see if you're talking nonsense, because that's also the thing. He was talking nonsense. Now, the reason he could also get away with this is because he was already quite an accomplished mathematician. So they were like, well, he's an accomplished mathematician. So basically, instead of doing a peer review, they just believed him. They just trusted what he had to say, which is a problem. Peer review is important. Like, peer review stops nonsense from getting through. If you have a rigorous peer review process in which your peers have to review it before it is allowed to be published, that is a good thing. So basically think of it like, okay, I'm going to publish something about literature. Who would be the best type of people to look at a literature paper and decide whether or not it is good or bad? Probably people who are experts at literature, probably. So that is the importance of peer review. Okay. And that was what he was criticizing, that some of these journals just didn't really do peer review, and they really need to for academic credibility. Now, also, of course, he was commenting on academics who are essentially commenting outside their field of expertise. People who are often... Now, there's nothing wrong with speaking outside of your immediate field of expertise. That's not a bad thing. Like, the outsider perspective can be very, very helpful. It becomes a problem when you try to pretend or be very, very confident about being correct, about sort of coming in and saying, well, even though I don't really understand the science, I'm going to come in and pretend like I'm an authority and talk about it even though I don't really understand it. Basically, if you don't really understand something, you shouldn't be commenting on it. Like, yes, you could have an opinion, sure, but maybe don't try and publish academic papers when you don't know what you're talking about, essentially. And this also goes into the next one, which is that he was criticizing the fact that the editors at Social Text had more trust in academic authority over truthfulness, right? He was already an accomplished mathematician. So they were like, oh, well, if he knows what he's talking about, we'll just basically let him go. And this does happen. People, like this happens all the time. People who are already famous, for some reason, we continue to just give them more credit. Right? So even if, say, let's just take a made-up philosopher, let's just say, there's going to be a made-up philosopher, and this philosopher wrote an extremely influential book in the 60s. And then, even though none of their other stuff has really been particularly influential, they are still seen as this kind of expert figure. However, they might be seen as an expert figure even though they don't really have a reason to still be an expert. However, we will keep on going back to them to see what they have to say, even though they haven't really had an insightful comment since that time, but because they're an academic authority, we trust them over actual truthfulness and actual academic rigor. That is a problem. You need to make sure that the academia that you cite, that you source, that you look at, that you write is basically properly everything. It needs to be properly reviewed. It needs to be properly researched. It needs to be properly written. It needs to be as truthful as possible. It needs to have an interpretation section that is not weighed down by other allegiances, etc., etc. Now, another big thing he was criticizing, and I'm all for this because this is a big thing that I criticize a lot, is that he was also critiquing the way that you get intentionally obscure and obtuse language in academia. A lot of academia is hard for no reason, right? This is a thing that I have like a huge, huge problem with. That a lot of these writers, I mean, they're not actually writers, they're academics, but they write in such a way that most people would never be able to understand what they're saying. And the thing is, the reason I have also such a big problem with this is that academics ultimately are educators. And if you're writing in such a way that no one can understand what you're talking about, except for those who are just as enlightened as you and have also read the exact same books as you, you're not an educator. You are failing in your duty as being someone who is teaching, who is trying to increase knowledge in the world. By just using intentionally obscure language, you are also being elitist, classist. You are locking certain people out of understanding. That is a bad thing. Very, very scientific language is actually very easy to understand. It's very, very to the point. It is saying exactly what it is. Problem is that a lot of humanities subjects, philosophy, stuff like that, it can become very obtuse when it doesn't need to be. It's like they keep on talking even though they should probably shut up. That is basically the problem. And that is a big, big issue that the Sokal Hoax also showed. Because he wrote that particular paper in an intentionally obtuse nonsense way. Like I said, I read it. It's a nonsense paper. It's obvious that it's nonsense. But they gave it a pass because they were like, oh, look, it's written in this. You see, that's the thing. A lot of people read something complicated and they think if it's complicated, that means it's clever. When that's not true. Just because something's complicated doesn't mean it's clever. It means it's complicated. You didn't have to make it complicated. You did that on purpose. Because you hate learning. Okay, that's just me editorializing, but still. Now, the next thing, which kind of goes into this, is a critique of postmodern academia. Now, I kind of see myself as a postmodern academic in many ways, but there are many criticisms that you can levy against some branches of postmodern academia, where, for instance, it doesn't really go for a lot of academic rigor. It's basically very fast and loose, people talking in areas that they don't really understand. Essentially, all of these things that we've been talking about can be seen as criticisms of postmodern academia. However, you can do postmodern academia in a very robust way. So this is critiquing a certain type of postmodern sort of view. But that is something to keep in mind. If your academic means of communication has become so obfuscated that people can't really understand, or it's made to be intentionally difficult or vague, you're not actually benefiting anybody. You're not benefiting society. You're essentially just filleting yourself. So, yeah. The next one, which goes into this very important, is the critique of academic ethics. Right? It is important that we can trust an academic journal. It's important that we know it was properly peer-reviewed, that people didn't get money to like be published. You know, that things weren't. And when I say that, I don't mean like that you were paid. I mean like, think about how a whole bunch of okay, climate change is real. Okay, it is. However, there are a bunch of scientists who say that climate change isn't real. But if you just look at those scientists for like 8 seconds, all of them are in the pocket of big oil. They're basically all being paid by the oil industry. Or they're right-wing grifters who are trying to give their audience what they want, which is a critique of, reality. So basically, ethics in academia is very, very important because you want to know that you can actually trust the things that are being produced. And if you can't trust those things, then that kind of breaks down academia. And he was when Alan Sokal did this, he was showing that, listen, if this paper could get through, you can't really trust the people who were editing this journal. You can't trust them to be doing stuff properly. And that's a problem. And something very important. Now, these are the main things that he did, but I would also say that these are the last 2 points that I put here, which I think are worth looking at, is that this kind of did have a lasting impact on academic bad faith. Meaning that there are people now who try to claim that an entire area, like basically like postmodern academia, is all nonsense, where it isn't. There's a lot of things in there that I would say are very beneficial, and it can be done well, as I said. However, there are people who have now used this to sort of be like, oh, you don't need to listen to these people. And also I would say it kind of has an air of scientism to it, which is sort of the belief that science is the highest authority, that if science says it is, then it is, which also is a misunderstanding of science. It's a fetishism of science. Science isn't actually about facts. Science is about the pursuit of facts. Sometimes our best understanding of what is real is not true. Sometimes we are wrong. Sometimes new information, actually not sometimes, most of the time, new information comes out which disproves prior science. This happens all the time. The easiest way to just look at medicine, right? Medicine is constantly changing, evolving, adapting, which means that what we know now is not going to be the end point. So if you focus on science from a dogmatic perspective, you are doing a bad, basically. And this kind of hoax can and has caused some people to then distrust entire areas of academia. And as the last point I said here, it had an impact on anti-intellectual movements. I have seen basically right-wing grifters who have used the Sokal hoax to try and claim that academia is all nonsense, that like the humanities is all making things up, which they then use to justify things like racism and sexism, homophobia, because they'll look at, say, things like critical race theory. They'll look at things like queer theory. They'll look at things like feminism, and they're like, See, those are all also from, like, liberal academia. So they have this kind of thing. While I would say, like, I love the Sokal Hoax. I think it's a brilliant thing that he did to show, but it definitely can be used in a negative way, and I've seen it used in a negative way to incentivize an anti-intellectual perspective, and that is not a good thing. So, I'm going to end here. Hopefully this is interesting to you. It's a little bit of a thing. Now, also, I did this in my honors, and you can use some of these ideas and concepts if you're writing about the Sokal Hoax. It could be helpful. So yeah, hopefully this has been interesting, helpful, whatever. If it has, and if you're interested in supporting the work that I do, because I've made a lot of these videos, so if you want to support me, you can check out my books, or you can support me on Patreon. And if you either can't or don't want to, you could also do the like, comment, subscribe, all of those things if you are interested. So yes. Otherwise, I hope that you have a great day, week, and month ahead, and I hope that the Sokal Hoax was interesting to you.